In the previous lecture, Dolbach argued that our choices are determined, and he did this by drawing on two claims. First, everything in nature is determined by the laws, and second, mental activities are just part of nature along with everything else. That is, he thinks everything is part of nature, and mental activities are no exception. There are two obvious ways to avoid his deterministic conclusion about the mind. You could reject either of his claims. You can either reject the claim that the mind is part of nature, or reject the claim that everything that happens in nature is determined. To deny that mind is part of nature would be to diverge pretty radically from standard scientific assumptions and practices. It would be a dramatic move away from the trend of the Western intellectual tradition that tries to encompass everything under the natural worldview. But to reject the other claim, to claim that not everything that happens in nature is deterministic, is very much a live option in the sciences. So you can say the mind is part of nature, but nature may not be deterministic after all. And so a number of philosophers who think that, well, we're not sure whether determinism is true or not, still think that there's reason to be suspicious about free will, that they still think free will doesn't exist regardless of whether determinism is true. So, as I said, hard determinists like Dolbach depend on the assumption that determinism is true. But contemporary physics has cast doubt on this assumption, as we'll see in a little bit of detail in Lecture 12. But some philosophers think that it was really a mistake to get so obsessed with the idea of determinism, because the problems with free will run much deeper than determinism, that even if determinism is false, we still don't have free will. Now, these philosophers can't be called hard determinists, of course, because they're not relying on the idea of determinism. They're not saying the non-existence of free will arises because determinism is true. Still, they're obviously in important ways fellow travelers with the hard determinists, since they deny the existence of free will. So, like hard determinists, they're skeptics about free will. And they might be called impossibilists, because at least some of them think that free will is impossible, regardless of the truth of determinism. I'll consider here three such radical rejections of free will, beginning with the most radical. So one thoroughgoing rejection of free will would follow from the doctrine that's known as epiphenomenalism. That's the view that the mind has no effect at all on the physical world. So on this view, physical activity of the brain might cause mental experiences and mental events. Those experiences themselves don't cause anything else. They don't have any causal outputs. They are, in the language that's used, is they're epiphenomenal. They're basically little side effects that don't do any work. So to understand this notion, consider observing the exhaust from a jet flying overhead. You notice that the exhaust is associated with the jet moving. Whenever you see the jet, you always see the exhaust. But the exhaust doesn't make the jet move. It's just a byproduct of the burning of the fuel. The burning of the fuel is what makes the jet move. So there are two things. The burning of the fuel does two things. One is it makes the jet move. Another thing it does is it produces this irrelevant side effect, irrelevant at least for the purposes of the movement of the jet. Something similar has been proposed concerning mental experiences, that when you burn your hand, your brain causes you to move, and it also causes you to feel pain. But the epiphenomenalist maintains that the feeling of pain doesn't cause the motion, just like the exhaust from the jet doesn't cause the jet to move. Similarly, if you burn your hand, you might shriek, "Ow!" But this shriek isn't caused by the pain on the epiphenomenalist view. Rather, the pain is just a byproduct of the brain activity that doesn't have any further effect. Now, if the global view of epiphenomenalism that says all mental experiences, all mental events are like this, they don't actually cause anything else, then we definitely don't have free will, because the mind doesn't do anything at all causal. Few philosophers or psychologists accept this kind of approach as a general theory of mind. To many, it just seems incredible to claim that the feeling of pain has no relation to my screaming and moving away from the stove. But some have suggested that epiphenomenalism might be true about our decisions. That is, our decisions might be products of the brain that then don't themselves actually cause our behavior. So the idea is that our brain causes the behavior, and it causes the feeling that we made the decision that caused the behavior, but that feeling that the decision caused the behavior, that's an illusion. Dolbach actually says things sometimes that sound like this is what he's suggesting. In one work, he says that people sometimes claim to him in response to his theory, "But I feel free." But Dolbach goes on to say, quote, "This is an illusion that may be compared to that of the fly in the fable who, lighting upon the pole of a heavy carriage, applauded himself for directing its course. Man who thinks himself free is a fly who imagines he has power to move the universe, while he is himself unknowingly carried along by it." Obviously, the fly is doing nothing to contribute to the course of the carriage. So if we are really like the fly on the carriage and our minds contribute nothing to our actions, then our minds don't direct our actions at all, and we clearly don't have free will in that case. So if we really are like the fly on the pole of the carriage, we don't have any kind of free will. Now, it's worth noting that determinism doesn't have to be true in order for epiphenomenalism to be true. A determinist could, in fact, maintain perfectly well that decisions do determine the outcomes. In fact, that's more in line with what Dolbach says elsewhere. Elsewhere, he seems to say decisions cause the outcomes. So he seems to suggest a kind of psychological determinism for actions. Our actions are caused by our motives, which are caused by our internal states, and so on. That very view requires that our decisions do make a difference. So in Dolbach's example of the thirsty man who takes a drink, Dolbach says that the man is determined to take a drink given his motives. But that means that his motives are making a difference. So Dolbach is not consistent on this point. But determinism can be true even if epiphenomenalism is false. So it might turn out that epiphenomenalism is not true, hopefully it's not true, but determinism could still be true. So the idea of epiphenomenalism is really quite independent of determinism. Again, according to the epiphenomenal view that we're considering now, decisions are just a byproduct of our brain activity. But the decisions themselves are causally inert. They're dead ends. The action is produced by brain processes that are different from the decision, and that decision that you feel is just an irrelevant flourish. As I said, that would exclude the possibility of free will, and it wouldn't matter whether determinism was true. Even if determinism is false, if our decisions don't cause our actions, then our decisions certainly don't count as freely causing our actions. So epiphenomenalism would undermine free will, but it is a deeply radical view. If it's true, almost everything we think about normal human action is false. It would threaten to undercut a huge part of the fabric of common sense. In Lecture 14, we'll consider a bit of evidence that might support the view, but I can tell you now that the evidence is far from conclusive, that there's no knockdown evidence in favor of this deeply troubling view that the mind decision-making doesn't cause anything. A very different kind of argument for the impossibility of free will comes from early Buddhist philosophy. Early Buddhists actually advocated a version of determinism, so that was part of their view. They maintained that each event was caused by some prior event. Indeed, like Dolbach, they accept psychological determinism, that every psychological event is caused by earlier psychological or physical events. But Buddhism presents an even more radical attack on free will. Because according to a central line of thought in Buddhism, the very notion of the self is a mistake. As we've seen, the central libertarian account of free will is an agent-causal account. And according to that account, the self causes the action without itself being caused. That was what we found in the notion of agent causation in Lecture 6. And it rings kind of intuitively plausible. An action only counts as freely willed if it is first done by me, and second, I could have done otherwise. The self is deeply implicated in there. It's me who's doing it, that's required, and it has to be the case that I could have done otherwise. But Buddhists have maintained that the very idea of self is an illusion. And the kind of argument that's in the background of this is the idea that all that really exists are fleeting things like thoughts and feelings. And there's nothing in there that will count as a soul or a self that generates the choices and makes decisions. Now, this too is a radical view. And And I want to emphasize that because it's not a sort of normal everyday view of the self. They're suggesting that the way we usually think about the self is completely wrong. And it turns out that there are similar ideas in Western philosophy, and it's useful to at least acknowledge these to give a sense that there was a kind of intellectual convergence across two very different traditions on this idea that the everyday notion of the self is really confused. So David Hume, who we saw in Lecture 7, maintained that the self is just a bundle of mental states. And so even if the self exists at one moment, a different self will exist as the mental states change. Part of Hume's argument here was that we get a misleading picture of the nature of the self from those who favor introspection. People say things like, well, I look inside and I see my enduring self. And Hume's response is, oh yeah, what does it look like? He says, because when I look in, I only see this or that thought or perception. I never see anything, he says, that's remotely like a self that's constant and invariable. It's not like there's some solid nugget of self that I see that stays the same from week to week or day to day or even minute to minute. He says, what I see when I look inside are little particular mental experiences, a little bit of a headache, a little bit of a toothache, a little bit of thirst. So that's what I see when I look inside. He says, that's what it is for me. That's the way it is when I look inside my own mind and try to find a self. But he thinks that this applies to other people as well. And what he goes on to say is, if there's nothing we see when we introspect that would answer to the notion of a self, if there's nothing we see that has this characteristic, why should we believe there is such a thing? The Buddhists offer a related line of argument against the existence of the self, but they focus on the fact that mental activity is a sequence of events. So again, they're arguing that there's no self that does the choosing. And one Buddhist author makes the point as follows. From memory arises intention, from intention thought, from thought exertion, from exertion a current in the body, and from this current comes the action. What does the self do in this process? Now, the particular details here are no doubt wrong. It's not clear that thought has to arise from intention, but the point is that a process of decision-making is just that. It's a process. There is, according to the Buddhist, there's no kernel of self that does the choosing. It's just a chain of events. One thing causes another thing, and that causes the next, and so on. Now, unlike the epiphenomenalist, the Buddhists can say that the mental activity does cause action. They can say the process from one mental state to another, that's a causal process. It's a causal sequence. But according to the Buddhist view, when we say that the self makes a decision, that's where we get into trouble. That's where we make a mistake. They say, at best, that is a useful fiction to say that the self makes a decision. It simplifies the description. We talk this way of the self making a decision because it makes it easier to say, to communicate something. But as a matter of fact, what really happens is just this sequence of events. Nowhere in that sequence is there an agent who stands apart from things and makes a choice. The idea of the self on this account is just an illusion. So let me repeat this. The Buddhist accepts that there are experiences and thoughts and intentions and memories, and those things interact in causal ways. They have causal powers. However, all of them are just momentary events. They're just momentary episodes. There's no thing that has the memories. So we talk of the self making choices. And that might be fine, they say, so long as we recognize that this is an expression of convenience. Because all that really exists are the momentary fleeting things, the events. So if we say something like that John saw the beer and he chose to pick it up, this isn't strictly true, that there isn't a self, John, who both saw the beer and then chose to pick it up. What is strictly true is that there was a visual perception of beer, which led to a motivation to pick up beer, which led to an intention to pick up beer. Nowhere in there is there a self doing anything. It's just a chain of events. Now, as I stressed initially, this is an enormously controversial view. But if the Buddhists are right that the idea of self is an illusion, then agent causation seems impossible. Because the very thing that was supposed to bear the weight of free will, the self, doesn't even exist. And at that point, it's clear that determinism doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether determinism is true. The problem for free will is not determinism. The self can't be free and responsible because it doesn't even exist. So we don't have even the most basic element that's required for free will on this Buddhist view. The Buddhist view of the self continues to be influential. Many philosophers think that the everyday notion of the self is deeply confused and that Buddhism promoted a key insight in rejecting this notion. However, it often strikes people as deeply implausible. And even though the view that the self is an illusion is central to much Buddhist philosophy, it's not so clear that practicing Buddhists accept it on the whole. If we look at Buddhism on the ground, as it were, at people who practice Buddhism, we don't find people widely rejecting the idea of a self. Now, of course, one line of thought in philosophical Buddhism is that achieving the full recognition that the self doesn't exist is extremely difficult. It might take years and years to achieve. And that might explain why people find it so hard to give up the idea of self. But an alternative view is that people find it hard to give up the idea of self because it's actually implausible. The idea that there is no self rings as something that is difficult to believe. And many philosophers today, even though many think that it's a plausible view that should be explored, many others think that it's just too extreme to countenance. So one might dismiss the Buddhist worry by claiming that their view of the self is just too extreme, it goes too far. In contemporary Western philosophy, there are a number of philosophers, contemporary philosophers, living philosophers, who think that we lack free will regardless of whether determinism is true. And I want to give the details of perhaps the most prominent argument to that effect in a minute. But first, I want to present a common thread behind many of those who are skeptical about free will. If you'll recall how we left the libertarian in Lecture 6, in Campbell's hands, the libertarian says that the way the self makes decisions is neither random nor determined. And it seems like that wipes the platter clean. What else could it be like? If it's not determined and it's not random, what is the self doing? It's doing something that's apart from these two categories that we understand. I think the free will skeptic often has something like this lurking behind his conviction that there's no such thing as free will. On the one hand, the skeptic thinks that agent causation theories like Campbell's theory, accurately describe what we think we have. We think we have a free will in which the self is the sole cause and the self could have done otherwise. But in fact, there's nothing that fits the bill. Once we press on how such a thing might work, once we try to figure out how the self might be not determined but not random, the whole thing just collapses. I think for many free will skeptics, that is really the worry that drives them to think that there's no such thing about free will. And notice that nothing about that assumes determinism. The argument is that regardless of how that debate gets settled, regardless of whether we have determinism, we don't have free will. And the particular argument that I want to focus on comes from Galen Strawson, a British philosopher. And he says this is not a novel argument. He says this is an old argument. It's an argument for why free will is impossible. And it's based on the idea that what we want out of free will is just unattainable. So he calls this the basic argument. And I'm going to give a simple form of it first and then go on to give it in much more detail. So here's the simple form. In order to be truly morally responsible for one's actions, one would have to be the cause of himself. But it is impossible for anything to be the cause of itself. Therefore, it is impossible for anyone to be truly morally responsible for his actions. Now that's obviously a really abbreviated version of an argument, so we'll want to unpack it to see how it's supposed to work. Strawson sets it up as an argument about moral responsibility, but it's supposed to apply to free will as well. He thinks that what we're interested in is the kind of free will that's connected with moral responsibility. So again, he thinks in order to have free will, one would have to be the cause of himself. Now, Again, Strawson, like previous theorists, emphasizes that the idea that he's interested in is this notion of free will that's connected to responsibility. It's not just any old notion of free will or responsibility. He says, in fact, what we really want to know about is the notion of free will and responsibility that would make it appropriate to send people to hell. He said, that's what we want to figure out. What do you need to have that kind of free will? And what do you need to be responsible in the right way to be deserving of going to hell? And that's what he thinks is at stake. And that's what he thinks is impossible. We can't have that kind of responsibility. So he elaborates on this argument more fully as follows. He says, my decisions depend on what I am like, the way I am, my nature. In particular, my decisions depend on the characteristics of my mind. It isn't the features of my toes or the temperature on distant planets that matter for responsibility. Those would only matter insofar as they get filtered through my mind, only if they were somehow represented in my mind as thoughts about the temperature on distant planets or feelings about my toes. That's the only way they might impact my decisions, and decisions are what matter for responsibility. So he says, if my decisions don't depend on the way I am, then they don't even count as my decisions. So, of course, what matters for my decisions is that they depend on the way I am. They depend on my nature. But then he says, for me to be truly responsible for my decision, I must be responsible for the way I am. I have to be responsible for my nature. Otherwise, how can I be responsible for what I did? Because what I did came from my nature. Well, how could I be responsible for the way I am? In particular, how can I be responsible for characteristics of my mind? Well, here's something that comes to mind. You could say, maybe in the past, a year ago, I intentionally decided to become a certain way. So just to have a concrete example, let's suppose I decided to adopt a certain mental habit, that I decided that when I encounter people in need, I will imagine myself in their position. And let's further suppose that as a result of this decision last year, I now do put myself in others' place more often. Strawson says, fine. But at the point last year, when I made that decision to become a certain way, when I decided that I would put myself in other people's place, I already was a certain way. I already had a certain nature. And the decision I made then was based on the way I was then. So he says, in order for me to be responsible for that decision, I would have had to be responsible for the nature I had when I made that decision. That is, in order for me to be responsible for my decision to empathize with the needy, I have to be responsible for the nature I had at the time I made that decision. But now we're on a slippery slope of doom. How could I be responsible for the nature I had a year ago? Well, maybe I made a choice 5 years ago that led to the nature I had 1 year ago. But this leads to an obvious regress. The game just keeps going, stretching back to my birth. And since I can't be responsible for my birth, I can't be responsible at all. So the basic idea is that I can only be responsible for things that I chose, but my choices depend on my nature. Otherwise, they wouldn't be my choices. But at the most basic level, I didn't choose my nature. The very thing that issues my decisions is something I didn't choose. So I can't be responsible for the products of that nature. Another way to see this point is to start from the other direction. We don't choose to be born. We don't choose to have the body and the genetics with which we're born. We don't choose the environment in which we're raised. All of these initial facts are not in our control. And that means that the way we are initially, our initial nature, is not up to us. We're obviously not responsible for our initial nature, but that nature is the basis for any choice that we make to develop a different nature. So we can never be truly responsible for anything because it all comes from a nature that we didn't choose. So far, you might be thinking, this all sounds pretty deterministic. Indeed, you might think it sounds a lot like a cleaner version of Dolbach's argument. But Strawson doesn't depend on determinism for his argument. On the contrary, he says adding in indeterministic factors doesn't help at all. So he writes, it is absurd to suppose that indeterministic or random factors for which one is in no way responsible can in themselves contribute in any way to one's being truly morally responsible for how one is. So what he's saying is that if you add a dash of indeterminism into the mix, that part of my nature was formed in random ways, That doesn't contribute at all to my being responsible because I'm not responsible for the randomness. So, like the hard determinists before him, Strawson is promoting a skeptical view about free will. He claims free will just doesn't exist, and it's impossible, as a result, for people to be truly morally responsible. The core problem, according to the basic argument that he's given, is that our ideas of free will and responsibility carry a presupposition that simply can't be met. The one notion, he thinks, that would satisfy us, the notion that would allow us an inroad to stop the regress, to let us say the buck stops here, the one thing that could do that would be a self that somehow caused itself. And that is why Strawson thinks that that's what's at the heart of the free will problem. We would have free will if the self could somehow cause itself without being caused. But that, he says, is impossible. Still, though, he thinks that our everyday notions presuppose this. They presuppose that a person is what he calls a causa sui, that is, a cause of itself. And he maintains that we can find this view explicitly endorsed by a number of philosophers. One of these is the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who lived from 1905 to 1980. He was an important figure in the philosophical movement existentialism, and he coined what came to be a slogan for that movement. The claim was that existence precedes essence, and the idea is that we exist first, and then we choose our nature. In Sartre's view, each person chooses himself. As a result, Sartre says, each man is responsible for what he is. And he says, the first effect of existentialism is that it places the entire responsibility for every man's existence squarely upon his own shoulders. So here we have Sartre suggesting that we exist first and then we decide what our nature will be. Sartre himself comes later to think that this position was too extreme. In an interview from 1969, he said he was surprised when he read some of his earlier remarks about free will and responsibility. He says, "When I read this, I said to myself, it's incredible. I actually believe that." But Sartre's existentialist view of free will, that somehow we get to freely choose our nature, our essence, seems to resonate with what many people want out of free will. And indeed, one of the most popular college courses in philosophy, apart from the courses that students are required to take, is existentialism. Now, the role of the existentialist philosophy of free will may not be the whole explanation for this, but there is no doubt that existentialism is a philosophy that speaks to people, at least when they're in their early 20s. As Strawson notes, again, this argument against free will is not novel. He thinks it's been around for a long time, and he's resuscitating it because he thinks contemporary philosophers have failed to grapple with it. They've failed to acknowledge the depth of the argument. And he says his diagnosis of the problem can be found in the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived from 1844 to 1900. Nietzsche said that this idea that the self causes itself is, quote, the best self-contradiction that has been conceived so far. And he says that this is really what's involved in the desire for free will, that people think that you pull oneself up into existence by the hair out of the swamps of nothingness. Obviously, if that's right, if free will requires that we create ourselves from scratch out of the swamps of nothingness, then it seems pretty unlikely that we do that. It becomes difficult to understand how it's even possible. And that's why Strawson thinks that the entire idea of free will is hopeless. It's based on a yearning that can never be satisfied, regardless of how the determinist-indeterminist debate is settled. If free will is impossible, this would seem to have major implications for how we treat each other and how we think about ourselves. Libertarians get to promote the status quo because on their view, we got everything just right. We think we have indeterminist free will, and we're correct in that thought. So it's perfectly appropriate to continue with our ethical practices of punishment. People can be fully responsible for their actions, maybe so much so that some deserve to go to hell. Compatibilists also get to promote the status quo because their view is the don't worry, be happy view of free will. Even if determinism is true, it doesn't matter for any of the ethical issues. for determinism is perfectly consistent on their view with our standing ethical views. Free will skeptics, on the other hand, can't rest so easy. And this wasn't lost even on the earliest skeptics like Dolbach. He tried to address these worries, and we also find those concerns in Buddhism and philosophers like Strawson. In many of these cases, the free will skeptic will maintain that the morally correct course of action is to institute changes in how we treat each other, and we'll take up these issues in some detail later in the course. Over the last 6 lectures, we've seen representative accounts of the major views on free will: libertarianism, compatibilism, and skepticism. If you're feeling like each of these views has something in its favor as well as serious drawbacks, you aren't alone. Philosophers have definitely not reached a consensus on this problem. Libertarianism seems intuitively really plausible until you start to press on it for a detailed account of how agent causation is supposed to work. And then it seems like it resorts to courting mystery. And that's a large part of what drives free will skeptics. They think that what libertarians strive for is in fact what we would need, but what they want can't be satisfied. The hard-minded philosopher here just takes his medicine and says, no free will. But the problem is that that's really hard to believe. It's really hard to believe that people aren't morally responsible. And that might lead you to think that compatibilism was right, that we can have both free will and determinism. But at that point, you might worry that you're just cheating to get out of the problem. And so to this day, over 2,000 years after the problem of free will was formulated, we're still left with a deep, persistent philosophical trouble.